Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma, and today I want to start by talking about the early Buddhist teachings, something that's often referred to as the Dharma. And we know that these teachings are thousands of years old, and since the time of the Buddha they've been recollected and memorized and repeated, written down, maybe added to sometimes. Certainly they've been translated and then they've been taught and retaught, and they've been filtered. So whenever somebody like me talks about the Dharma, we're just offering our understanding of it. I can't possibly claim that this is the one true teaching. I can talk about what I find to be useful. But like tap water, it's been through a number of people before it got here. And it actually calls for some engagement, because the teachings don't actually offer a simple instruction manual. It doesn't have any steps and diagrams in it. So we can't absolve ourselves from the task of thinking. We have to do some thinking. We have to do some figuring out for ourselves what works. We have to work out what's going to help us. Now, mindfulness and Buddhist practice are often taught as a kind of spiritual technology, the way of solving our problems. And there are all sorts of mindfulness-based interventions that really help in alleviating depression and stress and anxiety and so on. It can be really good, really positive. And for some people, practice might simply be about becoming a bit less reactive. But the practice and the Dharma are also taught in support of something much deeper. They actually point to a radically different way of living in the world. So you could see this path as something that could inform your whole life. Whatever it is that motivates you to practice, I think it's important to remember that the teachings themselves are a means. They're not an end. They're just a means to an end. And when you read accounts of the Buddha's teaching, he comes across as quite a pragmatist. The teachings are never really about dogma. They're much more about skillful means and figuring out what works. And this comes up over and over in different places. So, for example, there's a famous teaching, the teaching on the raft. It talks about someone travelling along the road and seeing a large body of water. And the near shore is not safe, but the far shore is perfectly safe. It's a sanctuary. And the person thinks, well, why don't I gather grass and sticks and branches and leaves and make a raft? And then when they use this raft to cross over to the far side, they think, well, this raft's been very helpful to me. Why don't I put it on my head or stick it on my shoulder and go wherever I want? And the Buddha suggests this would be a mistake, because he says, what should that person do with the raft? When they'd crossed over, they should think, this raft has been very helpful to me. Why don't I beach it on dry land? Or set it adrift on the water and go wherever I want. And then he goes on to talk about how his teachings are similar to a raft, they're for crossing over. They're not for holding on to. So he actually says, by understanding the simile of the raft, you will even give up the teachings, let alone what is against the teachings. Now, I've come across various interpretations of this particular story, the raft simile, if you like. I've come across people speculating about whether it means at some point you can just abandon practice. But I actually think that's missing the point. So the message for me is simply that you should use the teachings, not cling to them, don't carry them about with you, but just use them when you need them. And look at the teachings and the practice as an expedient. They're not ends in themselves, they're simply what helps us get across the river. And as the old Jimmy Cliff song goes, there might be many rivers to cross. And as Stephen Batchelor, one of the teachers and writers that's influenced me, he once said, it makes little sense to ask, is this really Buddhism? The only relevant question is, does it float? So I think treating our practice as anything other than a raft, anything other than a vehicle, if you like, can be a bit problematic. It's very easy to incorporate it into our sense of identity, our sense of who we are. It's very easy to start thinking that our particular version of the Dharma is the only Dharma. And to forget that it is just a vehicle, it's just a raft for getting over to the other side. So when the Buddha says, I have taught how the teaching is similar to a raft, it's for crossing over, not for holding on. To me, this reads as an encouragement to hold our practice quite lightly, to apply what we've learned in quite a practical way, not to encumber ourselves with it. It might sometimes mean dropping something that we found has been helpful in the past. Maybe knowing that we can come back to it in the future if we need to. But sometimes also staying with a practice or an approach or a tradition if it's helping us. I do think it's really useful every so often to ask ourselves, what we're doing and why we're doing it. So what habits we're reinforcing, what kind of life we're building for ourselves, and actually to take stock and question what it is that we're cultivating. And if we have a spiritual practice of any kind, maybe to ask ourselves whether that practice is helping us to respond to our world more skillfully or not. And I do find this idea of skill and means to be helpful here. Skill and means isn't about literal truth, it's about pragmatic truth. It's about whatever brings us closer to awakening. Whatever brings us closer to awakening. And there's many texts, many of the early texts, describe the Buddha's ability to adapt his teaching method according to whoever was listening. So he would talk in different ways to a king or a blacksmith or a Brahmin. And the term skill and means really describes flexibility in the methods of teaching, but it also applies to how we practice, how we actually engage with the Dharma, the teachings, and how we practice. And when I talk about skill and means in relation to our practice, I'm talking about the various ways that we cultivate the Eightfold Path, which is the training in ethics and mental development and wisdom that forms the basis of all Buddhist traditions. How are we actually doing this? Practice is often defined too narrowly. So the word in Pali that's usually translated as practice or cultivation is bhavana. And bhavana literally means bringing something into being. And it refers to the whole of the Eightfold Path, not just mindfulness, all of it. In many Buddhist cultures, bhavana has been taken to mean meditation. But it's not just meditation. I think we have to resist that idea. It's not just what you do on a cushion. It's practice, and practice can incorporate everything. We're always practicing something. We're always cultivating something, whether that's something skillful or not. We might be cultivating resentment and irritation, or we might be cultivating kindness and patience and peace. Either way, we're reinforcing something. And at any time throughout the day, we can ask ourselves about this. What is it I'm practicing right now? What am I reinforcing right now? And this is where skill and means comes in, because skill and means is an important investigation. If we can escape from a narrow, very conventional definition of practice, this opens up all sorts of possibilities. If we can use the raft wisely, using particular practices when they're needed and then putting them down when they're not, when something else is needed instead. To me, that is the very definition of skill and means. So most of us have some understanding of the Dharma. We can see the benefits of practicing mindfulness and kindness and compassion. We can see the benefits of learning to quiet the mind and living ethically and so on, seeing through the whole illusion of separateness. But we forget. Quite regularly we forget. Every so often we just go back into our old habits. And one reason we practice is that it helps us to naturalize a new set of habits. So it changes how we see the world. It counteracts our tendency to withdraw and react and obsess about things. It counteracts all these habits that lead to suffering. So to some extent, I see practice as a support to remembering. Mindfulness helps us to remember our values. And we're making a dedicated intention to be as present as we can. And practice is also a process of sensitization, because we're learning all about how the world touches us. We're becoming more sensitive to the feelings and energies that arise within us. And we're working constructively with those feelings and energies, and in embracing them, we allow them to be transformed. In fact, we're working on our whole understanding of how we relate to the world of conditions and the power that that world has over us, and how it doesn't have to have quite so much power over us as we think it does. And there's many ways to work with this. There's more than one way to work with this. There's more than one raft. So maybe we should be using and discarding many rafts depending upon the situation. Maybe not all of the rafts have to be Buddhist ones. So let's say the task is to achieve a degree of wisdom, and then naturalize that wisdom, embody it, live our lives accordingly. And that the qualities that we develop in our practice come into their own when they start to inform the rest of our life. And we might find ourselves noticing one day that our practice has helped us. Our raft floated, we got to the other side of the water. And we might gain some confidence in that raft, in our ability to deploy it next time we need it. And that's really good, that's really positive, but we might also become a bit attached to it. like I said, we might incorporate it into our sense of self and feel that we need to defend it and compare it, or even lose ourselves in the whole trappings of spiritual practice. Just forget the whole point of it all. Get into arguments with other people about which practice is better. I should think a sense of humor is quite valuable here. And I'm not actually aware that the Buddha talked much about humor, but I think a sense of humor can be a great example of skill in means, especially our ability to laugh kindly at ourselves when we start taking everything much too seriously, or when we get hijacked by self-righteousness. So if you've ever become obsessed about something, if you've ever started believing all the stories in your head and then noticed yourself doing it and come back down to earth, when we can do that and laugh about it, I think that's also a form of inner training and development. I actually think it's maybe even as valuable as sitting practice. Because for me, it's an example of how everything can be insight. Difficult emotions are a good thing. Discomfort is a good thing, but only if we have the flexibility and the adaptability to use them as a source of insight. And if you don't understand the purpose of the teachings, they're not going to bring you any insight. In fact, they can just end up bringing you a lot of suffering. So if you cling to your practice as something that has to be a certain way, there's a chance you'll end up carrying that raft around on your back all day, and it's not going to help you, because we practice for the sake of crossing over and nothing else. So that's what I wanted to say this time, and I'm very much appreciative of you listening, and I hope you can join again next time.